Hey guys, it's Kyle, back with another video on the sequelize ORM and creating a Node.js project. For this video, we're going to see if an email is already taken. So remember that in our last video, we checked to see if a username is already taken. Now we want to check to see if an email is already taken. This video is going to go a lot faster than the last one, I promise you, because this is pretty much doing the exact same thing as this. It's just doing it with email instead of username. So we can copy a lot of the code that we had already written. Okay, so let's collapse this function, and we're going to write a new function that says async function, and then we're going to say email exists. And we're going to pass in, and we're going to pass in, lo and behold, a username. Nope, just kidding. A email. Okay, so now we're basically saying, does this email exist in our database? So let's add a little function, or not function, comment here, that says function checks if email already exists in database. Exactly the same comment as we have above. Return user if email already taken, false otherwise. Okay, so I'm going to take the code that was inside of here and I'm going to copy it verbatim. So let's just copy it and place it inside of here. And then we want to change anything that's called username to email. Okay, we're still going to find a user, but now we want to find one where email, not where username. And then if user, return user. So that's all done. That's good to go. Now in our user DB tests, we're going to require in this function, but we didn't actually export it. So make sure in userdb.js you export this new function. So email exists. Okay. And you may have noticed something that we're going to do here, because we're actually going to end up doing a little bit of refactoring. Now that I'm basically going to have to recreate this user several times, let's create a dummy function that we can call down here that will do this for us, so I don't have to write this several places. So let's say async function create dummy user. And then we're going to have it do this. So we'll cut that from there and paste it here. And then we're going to have it return this. Okay. So now we can say await create dummy user. And then let's create another helper function. We'll call this, so async function destroy dummy user. And this is going to take in a user instance. And then we're going to say this. So copy, or actually cut. So user and then paste. Return await. Okay, then we're going to say await destroy dummy user test. Let's actually run this test once just to make sure that refactoring did not break anything. And we're good to go. All right, so now we can collapse this again, and we're going to copy all three of these tests. Okay. And go down here. Now we're going to say it should see if an email already exists in the database. should throw an error because no email was passed, and should create a user, see if email already exists, and fail. All right, good. So now let's open up this first test and make sure that this is calling the correct one. So this should be email exists, and I don't think I imported it. I didn't. So up here, let's make sure to actually import this. So email exists. And then down here, we will change this to email exists. All right, run this and make sure that it passes. Okay, next, let's open up our second test, and should throw error because no email was passed. So make sure to change this to email exists. And we want to change this to no email. We'll go ahead and run this to make sure that it passes. All right, and we are good to go on that one. And finally, we want to should create user, see if email already exists, and fail. So this will create a dummy user. We want to check to make sure that their email exists. On test, this needs to get changed to test@test.com. And then we should just run this and make sure that it passes. And we're good to go. It did in fact pass. We can inspect the code if we really want to make sure that things did what they were supposed to do. So, all right, so now we know that this is working. We know that our two functions we have here do work. So we can run tests to make sure if they work. That's awesome. So the next step, once this is done, so this is done. So now the next step is to check if a user already exists. Let's compose these into an actual function. And how and where will we do that? Well, remember we have our user service, right? And we actually already started writing a test in user.test.js. It should see if a user already exists. So one thing we're going to do real quick here is I'm going to copy both of these helper functions into user.test.js because I already know that I'm probably going to need them. And then up at the top, we'll say const db equals require up one, up another, and models. All right, so now both of these will work, and we want to see if a user already exists. So we would expect that this is going to call a function in the user service. I'm going to delete these real quick so I don't have to constantly see them. Okay. So in our user service, let's return a function. So we'll say function or async function user exists. And this is going to take in a username and a password. Not username and a password. Username and an email. Okay. And let's actually call this validate user exists. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to return this function. So module.exports equals an object, and we'll say validate user exists. Okay. So right now this is returning undefined. So if we pass in a username and an email, we expect that if the username or email is correct or already exists, it's going to tell us. Otherwise, it should return false. So let's have it return false. Actually, null, because the opposite of an object really isn't false, it's null. Okay, So now in user tests.js, we need to invoke this function. So first let's require it, const, and we'll say validate user exists equals require up services user service. Okay. So we're going to call this function. We'll say const user equals await validate user exists, and it takes in two things: a username, which we'll say is test, and an email, we'll say test@test.com. Now, these users don't exist in this particular test, so right now we're going to say should see if user exists on non-existent user, on non-existent user. And make sure this is an async function. So we are going to pass in test and test@test.com. And now we're going to say expect user to be null. I believe null is a thing. Let's make sure. So null, yep. Assert that, so accept to be null. Okay. So if we run this, let's see what we get. And it did succeed. Now, this is kind of one of those situations where, yes, it technically did succeed, but obviously it only succeeded because we expected it to be null. But that's okay. We wanted to run the minimum amount of stuff to get it to pass, and it passed. Now, let's do the opposite of that test. So the next test we should run is it should see if a user already exists on an existent user. So this is the second form this function could take. User name. Let's be even more specific. So then we'll write async, and we're going to pass a function in here. And we're going to create our dummy function, or dummy now. So we're going to say const test equals await create dummy user, and then we're going to say then we're going to say const user equals await validate user exists, and we're going to pass in a username now. So we're going to say test and test@test.com, and then we're going to destroy the user. So we'll say await destroy dummy user and pass in test. Now, what are we expecting here? Well, we're expecting user dot to be an object. So let's see if this does pass. What's going on here? Oh, if. Okay, I'm like, why isn't this a test? And it failed, just like we expected it to fail. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, why the heck did it fail? Remember that in user service, all we're doing is returning null every single time. So now we need to actually invoke some of the different things. Where am I? Let's see here, user test. We need to actually invoke some of the different things we have from the user database. So let's look at our services. We have our user, and let's look at our user DB handler. We have email exists, and we have username exists. So let's have it pass in. So if username, so if that is true, now let's have it call. So let's have it await, and say const user equals await. Actually, hold on. Let's go up here and declare user. So user const user equals null. And then here, we're actually going to return user no matter what, because now user equals null. If username was passed in, let's run const. Let's see. Nope, not const. So user equals await, and let's say we need to grab this guy. So we need username exists. So right up here, we will say const username exists is equal to require user DB. And while we're here, we might as well say email exists as well, because we're going to do that in a second. So email exists. So await username exists, and pass in username. And this actually needs to be let, not const. All right. Now you may have noticed something that's going to happen here, and I'll show you that in a second. But for now, let's see if this actually does pass. All right, so expected false to be an object. So it returned false to us. And we'll see why in just a second. But before I go on to that, I want to say something. So it's going to, let's trace this, sorry. So this is going to say let username, or sorry, find out if this username exists. And this is going to be test, right? So then it's going to reach into username exists with this being test. And it's going to say find a user where their username is equal to test. If you can't find this user, return false, meaning that it couldn't find this user. We actually don't want it to return false anymore. Remember that I decided, I changed this. I said if it's not user, return null, because the opposite of an object in my mind is kind of null. It's not false. So in user DB, we're going to actually have this return null here, not false. But this means we have to do something else. One, let's also do this to this function. Okay, so email exists is also going to return null. Now in user DB test, that means we need to go through our tests now and do a little bit of cleanup. So we should expect this to be null, okay, and expect false to be false. There's an actual easier way to write that, but that's how I'm going to write it. So then we can say that this is okay and that that is okay. Same thing with email then. We want to change this to be null and this to be false. Let's run our entire test suite to make sure that these all still pass. They all still pass, so we are good to go. Now we can look at user test.js, run this test. And now it should say expected user to be null, or expected null to be an object. All right, so it's saying I tried to look for this user, but I failed. So let's see why it might have failed. Well, username test doesn't exist. It should be test_test. Remember that the username that we're creating, if we look at create dummy user, is test_test. So now if we run this function, I just wanted you to see that we needed to change null or false to null. But now if we run this test, we will see this. It should pass. All right, it was able to say, yes, there is a username called test. So now we've confirmed that this will pass and this will pass. Now let's do the same thing on email. So let's copy this. And now we're going to say on existent email. And we're going to say create a dummy user. We're going to pass in this. We're going to say expect this to be an object, but we need to go to validate user exists. And we're going to say else, okay, if, or not else, if email user equals await username exists, or not username exists, email exists, email. And actually, let's get rid of this because we should be passing both of them in. So we're going to say if username passes, if email passes. So if any one of these fails, let's say username fails, but then it will continue on to email. So this is actually not so great for us, right? Because basically we want to say, uh-oh, username didn't, or username failed. There is someone with this username already, but if they passed in a good email, then this is going to fail because it means that this is going to overwrite our user. So let's actually do this. Let's say let email, or not email, let username. We already used username, so let's say valid username equal null, and let valid email equal null. And this is no longer going to return user, it's going to return null if none of these pass. All right, so if username, then we're going to say valid username. And if email, we'll say valid email. Okay. Now, if either of those guys are still null by the time we get down here, then we're going to return null. So we'll say if username and, or not username, if valid username and valid email return And let's go with just one of them, so valid username, because remember, both of those are user objects. So we can just return the valid username, which is the same as returning a user object. Otherwise, we're going to return null. So let's make sure this exists. So now, if we run, hold on, let's see, if we go in here, we're actually going to see that these still pass because we're passing both. But now we need to make sure that if we don't pass a username or we don't pass an email, so if one of these is undefined, that we're going to throw the appropriate error. Okay, so we can't say if username, then we're good, or if email, we're good. So this checks both of them. And you might be tempted, I can actually hear someone saying already, well, why not just write it so that you can pass one or the other and it will return that? Well, that's true, but right now we need both of them. And this is, again, I think one of the benefits of writing test code or writing code with tests is that, yes, I could write something that says if username exists or if email exists, we're okay, except I don't have any reason for that right now. Why would I try to predict the future? There might be a case in the future where I want to have a function that tests for just emails or tests for just usernames, except guess what I already did? I already did that in userdb. So in the future, if I want a function that just tests usernames, I can write a function that says just username and then grab just username. Okay? So don't create functionality that isn't needed. All right, so let's create a test, and we're going to say it should see if user already exists when only, no, that's not a good. It should throw an error because only one arg was passed to see if user exists. It's not the best description, but I don't know. That's what we're going with right now. Okay, so why do I keep saying if? It, not if, it. All right, so we're going to do the same thing we did in the userdb tests. We're going to put this inside of a try block, and then we're going to catch the error and see if the error is what we wanted it to be. All right, so we'll say const test equals await create dummy user, and then we're going to basically just copy this right here. No longer in the mood to type things, except we're not going to pass in, we're only going to pass in one argument. Okay, and then we want to expect e.to be an error, and we want to expect e.message.to equal function args must be username and email. Okay. Let's actually say invalid argument passed. So invalid number of args passed. Please pass username and email. All right, so actually let's not do one, let's do none. And then let's copy this message. Copy. All right, and make sure to then delete. So we're going to try. Now here's the thing. This is actually going to fail right here. So we're going to want to, we definitely need to destroy this user, but we won't have access to test anymore. So let's make sure to declare test outside of here. So const test, or sorry, not const, let test equal null. And then we're going to grab that here so that we can do something with it here. So test dot await destroy dummy user test. Okay, there we go. So we don't actually need to do this. We're just going to await validate. All right, it should throw an error. So now we're going to copy this message here, go into user service, and we will say if username is not equal to anything. So not equal, no. If username equals null or username equals undefined, throw new error and paste that in there. All right, and actually let's change that to, and we have a, so, or email is equal to null, or email is equal to undefined. I do realize that I could just put if username is not true or email is not true, except that also means that they could pass in two Boolean variables, and this would pass. So we're also going to place this, so if not equal username, or there's just a lot of testing that goes here, not equal email. Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. I think that can be better. So it'll also catch strings that are, yeah, that's okay. So we're going to go with that. So if either of those are not equal, then we're going to say invalid number of args, please pass. All right, so we'll run this test, and it should fail, or well, it should actually succeed, but the function should fail. Awesome. Okay. So we want to run this same test, but no args. So let's say no arg, because no args were passed. Okay, and then we want to run this same test. So we're going to copy it, paste, because one arg was passed. And for this, we're going to say await, and we'll pass in test underscore test, and play. And it passed. We're good to go. Check the database real quick just to make sure that we're not... Ooh, some things are actually running. So this is concerning. D9 or 6. Did you start with... So this is E. Alright, so I must have had something in there that didn't say destroy tests at some point. If I delete all of you, so let's make sure that our tests aren't leaving anything behind. Delete the entire database. No, the entire table, I mean. Where are we at? 38? Sorry, guys. Okay, let's run the entire suite now just to make sure. So we're going to go back up. Run the suite. Everything passed, and we shouldn't have any users. Okay, good. Run this suite. Everything passes, and we should not have any users. Awesome. Okay. Not sure what created those users, but we are good to go. So now we can check. We have a user service that will confidently validate to see if a user exists. If we pass it in a username and an email, it throws the appropriate errors that it needs to throw. So the next thing we would do is go back up to the user gateway. Remember that the gateway is kind of like the director of traffic. So it's going to call down to the user service to say, does this user exist? If they do, then it will probably do something similar to this, where it's going to be like, this user already exists. Sorry, can't do this. Otherwise, it's going to continue to move forward. We will do that in the next video. I'll see you then.